Howdy everyone, today I'm taking a look at a venerable old Canon L macro lens which doesn't get reviewed very often, the EF 180mm f3.5 USM Macro L. It's an expensive lens costing about £900 or 1,300 US dollars, and like all L lenses, it's designed to work with Canon's full frame or APS-C cameras. This lens was lent to me for testing by Sean Swanepoel, whose photography website is seansp.com. Thanks Sean. He was wondering if his lens is sharp enough to have made my sharpest lenses I ever tested video. We'll see about that in a minute. Macro lenses normally have a focal length hovering around the 100mm mark. This lens is 180. Serious macro photographers often prefer a more telephoto lens for two major reasons. Firstly, you don't have to get as close to your subject, which can be useful for taking pictures of insects or small animals which might like to run away from you. Secondly, the telephoto perspective gives you a tighter and more compressed background in your pictures. This is a lens which, no matter how good it might be, isn't particularly popular on the market. Obviously, it's a lot more expensive than a regular 100mm macro lens, and it's harder to use a telephoto lens with a narrower aperture because it's harder to get a sharp picture handheld. A tripod will be your best friend here. f3.5 isn't the widest aperture in the world, but it will give you a nicely out of focus background, not bad for portrait pictures. Let's take a look at this thing's build quality. It's a beast from the days when Canon's L lenses were made of metal. It weighs just over 1 kilogram and it will take up plenty of room in your camera bag. It's a simple lens with excellent build quality. The focus ring turns very smoothly indeed and very precisely, and of course there is full-time manual focus available. The lens has a metal lens mount. There is no gasket for weather sealing in the rear, but the glass element at the back is sealed into the camera body perfectly. This lens has a very slow autofocus mechanism. It is at least very quiet and works accurately. You can limit the autofocus to 1.5 meters to infinity though, which will greatly speed things up. And that's all there is to say really. The build quality is really fantastic and simple. The only thing missing is image stabilization, but this is an older lens after all. Okay, image quality. Firstly, on a full frame camera, a 20 megapixel Canon 6D. Straight from f3.5, the lens is extremely sharp in the middle of the image with excellent contrast, and that sharpness continues into the corners. You can stop it down to f5.6 or f8 if you like for a touch more sharpness, but ultimately the only way you'll get a soft image from this optic is human error. A stupendous performance. Now onto APS-C. Let's take a look at things on an 18 megapixel Canon 60D. At f3.5, the lens is very sharp indeed still, although not quite perfect. It's a tiny bit less sharp in the corners, but still very good. At f5.6 we see a tiny improvement, but it's only at f8 that we get razor sharpness in those corners. Again, a really fantastic performance, although unsurprisingly the lens is a bit sharper on full frame. Let's see now about vignetting and distortion. Even on a full frame camera there's no distortion at all, and only a trace of peripheral darkness at f3.5. Stop down to f5.6 and you get uniform brightness across the image frame. Let's see now about the all-important close-up image quality. Here's an old sixpence bearing the likeness of Her Majesty, looking a little younger there than she does today. At f3.5 the close-up image quality is fairly sharp. It's at f5.6 that the bar lifts to perfection and stays that sharp until f11. Stop down to f16 and the physical effects of diffraction start to kick in, bringing some softness. At f22 the image is soft, at f32 it's unusable. That's quite normal for a macro lens though. It's quite a good macro performance overall. Let's see now how the lens works against bright light. Macro lenses never do well here, especially older lenses, and the 180mm L is no exception. We're seeing very heavy flaring here. Use the lens hood when you're shooting outside. Finally, Bokeh. This lens is well known for having soft, out-of-focus backgrounds. The quality of its bokeh is indeed very soft, although when shooting at normal distances, it's nothing completely amazing. At the end of the day, the Canon 180mm f3.5 L is as simple a lens as it is high quality. The definition of high quality, really. It's pin sharp, with no vignetting or distortion, and its bokeh is nice. The secret flaring problem it has is pretty typical of a macro lens and pretty forgivable. The big question is whether this lens is worth £900 to you. It's harder to use than a 100mm f2.8 macro lens, although its backgrounds are undoubtedly much simpler, and you don't need to be as close to your subject. This lens's biggest competition right now is the Sigma 150mm f2.8 OS HSM macro, which is less expensive, has image stabilization, and is supposedly just as sharp. But people opting for this more expensive L lens will be getting themselves a truly stellar optic, which I think is even a bit sharper than Canon's famous 100mm f2.8 L macro lens. And yes, it probably would have had a place on my sharpest lenses list. Another classic Canon L lens.